On a Thursday morning in August of 1988, at the Harlan County Fairgrounds in Alma, Nebraska, a 64-year-old grain farmer named Earl Dunnigan backed a flatbed trailer through the livestock gate and did something that made 300 people stop and stare. He was not doing anything dramatic. He was not announcing himself or asking for attention. He was simply doing what he had driven 18 miles to do, which was unhook the chains on a 1948 Minneapolis Moline ZTU and drive it off the trailer under its own power. The machine was prairie gold in color, or had been once. What it was now was closer to the color of old wheat straw left in a field through winter, faded and matte and honest about its age. The exhaust pipe rose straight from the hood without a muffler cap. The rear tires were cracked along the sidewalls in the way that rubber cracks when it sits for years without moving, but they were holding air. A thin thread of blue smoke came from the stack as the engine warmed, burning off oil that had settled into places during 11 years of sitting still. Earl set the hand throttle, climbed down from the seat, and began walking the trailer chains back through their hooks. He did not look at the crowd that had gathered along the fence line. He did not look at the announcer's platform or the grandstands filling up for the afternoon events. He looked at the chains and the hooks and the work in front of him, the way a man looks at work when the work is the only thing that matters. On the other side of the staging area, Dale Vickers was doing the opposite of ignoring people. Dale had arrived at 7 that morning with a truck and trailer rig wide enough to need a spotter backing in, hauling a John Deere 496. Oh, that still had the showroom sticker in the cab window. He had spent the first hour letting people come to him, standing beside the tractor with his arms crossed and his Harlan County co-op hat pushed back on his head, answering questions he already knew the answers to. He was 47 years old and had run Vickers Farm Equipment in Alma for 10 years, and he understood that the Harlan County Fair tractor pull was not a competition so much as it was a demonstration. He had won the heavyweight class in 1985, 1986, and 1987. He planned to win it again in 1988. The 4960 was there to make sure everyone understood why. The machine was green and yellow and new enough that the paint hurt to look at in direct sun. It had a 16-speed power sync transmission and a turbocharged diesel engine rated at 202 horsepower, and it had been driven off a transporter from the factory in Waterloo less than 6 weeks ago. Dale had ordered it in the spring specifically for the fair, and he had not yet found a buyer for it, and he was not looking very hard to find one. The 4960 was not inventory, it was evidence. A local television reporter from Hastings had come to interview him at 9 o'clock. And Dale had given the interview standing in front of the tractor with one hand on the hood, the way a man stands next to something he is proud of. Let me tell you about Dale Vickers, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what happened that afternoon. Dale's father, Raymond Vickers, had opened Vickers Farm Equipment in 1961 with a handshake agreement with John Deere and a building he leased from the Lutheran Church for $200 a month. Raymond was a mechanic who had learned engines in the Korean War and come home to Nebraska because Nebraska was where he was from. He could diagnose a fuel system problem by sound and rebuild a carburetor on a tailgate in a parking lot. Farmers trusted him because he knew what he was talking about and because he never told them they needed something they did not need. Dale was not Raymond. Dale had gone to the University of Nebraska for 2 years, left without a degree, and come home to work in the dealership because the dealership was there, and because he was good with people in a way that Raymond had never been. He was quick and warm, and he remembered names and the names of trees and children, and he had a gift for making a farmer feel that the equipment he was currently running was holding him back from something better. He had doubled the dealership's gross revenue in 4 years by financing equipment that Raymond would have told customers they could not afford, and he believed with genuine conviction that newer was better, and that debt was just another word for investment, and that any farmer still running equipment from the 1960s or earlier was doing so out of stubbornness rather than wisdom. He saw Earl Dunnigan's flatbed come through the livestock gate at 10:15, and he saw the Minneapolis Moline on the trailer, and he laughed. Not a private laugh. A laugh directed at the 3 men standing nearest to him, loud enough to carry. He walked across the staging area while Earl was still working the chains. "Earl, I have to ask, is that thing entered in the poll or the parade?" Earl did not look up from the chains. Dale looked back at the men who had followed him over, making sure they were listening. "I'm serious because I saw the entry list and I did not see anything from 1948 on it." What is that, a ZTU? Those things are rated at what, 55 horsepower? Son, my 4960 is pushing 202. That is not a competition. That is a history lesson. He paused to let that land. I'll tell you what, Earl, you pull that machine today, and when it stalls at the starting line, you come find me afterward. I'll put you in a cab with air conditioning and a seat that doesn't require a tetanus shot. Something that actually works. Earl unhooked the last chain. He folded it back over the trailer stake. Then he looked at Dale for the first time. I paid my entry fee, Earl said. 50 horsepower minimum. This machine makes 55. He climbed back up to the seat and set his hands on the steering wheel, and that was the end of the conversation. Now, before we go further, you need to understand what was happening in Nebraska in the summer of 1988, because the story of that fairground does not make sense without it. In 1981, farmland in Iowa and Nebraska had reached an average of $2,147 per acre, driven up by export markets. Easy credit and a decade of farm lenders telling farmers that land was the one investment that could never go wrong. By 1987, that same land was selling for $790 per acre, a drop of 63% in 6 years. The Federal Reserve had raised the prime interest rate to 21.5% in 1981 to fight inflation, and farmers who had borrowed at variable rates found themselves paying interest that consumed everything they produced. The Farm Credit System reported losses of $2.7 billion in 1985. More than 300,000 American farms were lost between 1981 and 1988. In Harlan County alone, 47 farm families received foreclosure notices between 1983 and 1987. Dale Vickers had his best sales years between 1983 and 1986. 3 of those sales were to men sitting in the grandstands that Thursday afternoon. Leonard Marsh was 51 years old and farming 160 acres in the northeast corner of the county. He had bought a John Deere 4955 from Dale in the spring of 1985 for $68,000 with a farm credit loan at 14%. He was current on his payments, but just barely, and current on his payments meant that he had not bought new boots in 3 years, and that his wife clipped coupons for things she used to buy without thinking about it. His payment was $1,240 per month. Pete Colby had bought a 4450 from Dale in 1984 for $61,000. He was 3 months behind. Dwight Salter had sold 80 acres of ground his grandfather had broken to make the down payment on a 4240. He was current. He would never get those 80 acres back. All 3 of them watched Earl Dunnigan drive the Minneapolis Moline off the trailer and into the staging area. None of them said anything to each other. They did not need to. Let me tell you about Earl Dunnigan, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he brought to that fairground. Earl was born in 1924 on the same 320 acres he still farmed in a house his grandfather had built from lumber, hauled by wagon from McCook. His father, Walter Dunnigan, had taken over the farm in 1939 at 22 years old when Earl's grandfather died of pneumonia, and Walter had run it the same way his father had run it, which was without a dollar of bank debt and without any apology for that fact. Walter was not a complicated man. He rose before light worked until he could not see, and believed that a man who did not owe money to anyone was a man who could look anyone in the eye, and that this was worth more than anything a bank could offer him. In 1948, Walter had walked into the implement dealer in Alma, the same building that was now Vickers Farm Equipment, and bought a Minneapolis Moline ZTU for $1,950 cash. He had saved that money over 6 years of good corn crops and careful living, and he had paid it across the counter in an envelope, and the dealer had shaken his hand, and that had been that. Walter farmed with the Mini-Mo, as he called it, for 22 years until his heart gave out in June of 1970 while he was cultivating the South Field. They found him still on the seat. The engine had run out of fuel and stopped on its own. Earl had been farming alongside his father since he was 14 years old, and he took over the 320 acres without any transition plan or ceremony, because there was nothing to transition and no ceremony was needed. He was 46 years old, and he knew every acre and every drainage pattern and every corner post on the property. He knew the Mini-Mo the way you know something you have worked beside for most of your life. He ran the Minneapolis Moline until 1977, when the workload had grown enough that he needed something with more horsepower for the heavy tillage. He bought a used John Deere 4020 from a retiring neighbor for $4,200 cash, and he put the mini-mow in the back of the barn under a canvas tarp. He did not sell it. People asked him over the years why he didn't sell it, and he never had a good answer for them, or at least not one they seemed to find satisfying. It was his father's machine. That was the whole answer. What he did do every winter was go into the barn and take the tarp off and wipe the machine down and check the oil level and let a few pounds of air out of each tire so the rubber would not crack along the bead. His father had taught him to do this, and he did it the way his father had taught him, which was carefully and without rushing. His father's voice came to him easily in that barn. It always had. The first time Earl had tried to start the mini-mow on his own at 14 years old, he had flooded the carburetor and sat there feeling like a fool while his father walked over from the fence where he had been watching. Walter had not laughed. He had stood beside Earl and talked him through draining the bowl and resetting the choke and trying again. And when the engine caught, Walter had put a hand on Earl's shoulder and said, "Machines don't break down because they're old, son. They break down because people stop paying attention." Earl had never forgotten that. He had never had reason to. His wife Rose had been in the barn with him more times than he could count, sitting on the fender of the mini-mow, with her feet dangling while he worked on something underneath. She had a habit of bringing water out at 10 in the morning, 2 mason jars, and sitting on the fender until the jars were empty, and then going back to the house. She did not always talk. Sometimes she just sat there in the particular quiet of a working barn while the light came through the gaps in the siding. Rose had died in the spring of 1981 of lung cancer 7 years before the fair. Earl had not sold the machine after she died either. Now let me tell you about the Minneapolis Moline ZTU, because most of the people in those grandstands had never seen one up close, and you need to understand what it was before you can understand what it did. The ZTU was part of a tractor line Minneapolis Moline introduced in the late 1930s and refined through the early 1950s. The engine was a 4-cylinder 283 cubic inch overhead valve design, which was a more sophisticated arrangement than a lot of equipment being built at the same time. The factory rated it at 55 drawbar horsepower, and that rating was conservative in the way that engineers are conservative when they are writing numbers that will be tested in courtrooms. Field-tested farmers who had run ZTUs for years knew the machine would pull reliably at 58 to 60 horsepower before it began to heat soak, and that it would pull at that level with a torque curve so flat you could set a glass of water on the hood and not spill it. The power did not spike, and it did not drop. It came out even and steady, and it kept coming. There were no sensors, there was no computer, there was no traction management system designed to protect the machine from itself. There was a throttle and a clutch and a driver, and the machine did what the driver told it to do until one of the three gave out. Gus Reinhardt, the Harlan County Fair's equipment coordinator, had been checking entry paperwork since 8 that morning. He was 38 years old, trained as an agricultural engineer, and he had seen every tractor in the heavyweight class lineup by the time Earl brought the mini-mow to the registration table. He looked at the machine. He looked at Earl. He looked at the entry form. Sir Gus said, "This is the open heavyweight class. We have tractors entered today making over 180 horsepower." Earl held out the ZTU's specification sheet, a photocopy faded from the original 1948 owner's manual. 50 horsepower minimum, Earl said. "This machine makes 55. I paid my entry fee." Gus looked at the spec sheet. He looked at the 4960 gleaming 30 yards away. "These are very different machines," he said finally. Earl nodded. "That's the point. The smaller classes ran through the morning. Garden tractors, utilities, antiques competing only against each other. By noon, the grandstands were filling up, and the concession lines were long, and the heavyweight class staging area had 7 tractors in it, 6 of them representing the accumulated financing decisions of the previous decade, and one of them representing 1948. Dale Vickers moved through the crowd the way he always moved, which was with the ease of a man who believed the crowd was there for him. He stopped at the fence where Leonard Marsh was standing and clapped him on the shoulder. "Leonard, good to see you out here." Leonard looked at Dale's hand on his shoulder the way you look at something you don't quite have the energy to address. "Coming out to watch the pull," Dale said. "Should be a good show." He nodded toward the staging area toward the 4960. 202 horsepower Leonard. That is what progress looks like. He lowered his voice in a way that was not actually low, not like whatever that thing is that old Dunnigan dragged out. Leonard looked at the Minneapolis Moline. He did not say anything. Dale moved on. He had other people to see. Clarence Webb had walked down from the grandstands when he saw the Mini-Mo come through the gate because Clarence Webb was 78 years old and had been farming since 1930, and he had not seen a ZTU in working condition since 1963, and he wanted to look at it up close. He stood beside the machine while Earl was checking tire pressure, one hand on the rear fender, reading the machine the way old farmers read machines, which is with their whole body and not just their eyes. ZT, you, Clarence said. Lord, haven't seen one of these since your daddy had it. Earl looked up. Walter Dunnigan's machine. Clarence ran his hand along the fender. I remember when he bought it. 48, wasn't it? That's right. Clarence was quiet for a moment. That machine pulled stumps out of the Sanborn Creek bottom for 11 years before your daddy retired it. He never quit on Walter. Not once. Clarence looked at Earl. You planning to pull today? I am. Clarence nodded once slowly, the way old men nod when they already knew the answer and just needed to hear it confirmed. Then he walked back up to his seat in the grandstands without another word. Dale Vickers found Earl one more time before the heavyweight class began. He walked over with the particular energy of a man who has decided to be generous about something. Earl, I want to be honest with you because I think you deserve that. He crossed his arms. I'm not doing this to beat you. I already know I'm going to beat you. I've known that since you pulled in this morning. I'm doing this because the whole county is here, and I want them to see what 40 years of not keeping up with the times looks like. That machine, that is a museum piece. There's no shame in it. But you're going to embarrass yourself in front of every farmer in Harlan County, and I'd rather you heard that from me now than figured it out when the sled stops you at 30 feet. Earl looked at Dale for a long time, long enough that the two men standing behind Dale shifted their weight, long enough that Dale's certainty began to develop a hairline crack barely visible, easy to ignore. Then Earl turned back to the machine and checked the left rear tire pressure, and that was the end of the conversation. The heavyweight class was called to the staging area at 2 o'clock. The temperature was 84 degrees. The wind was out of the southwest. The track was hard-packed for the first 200 feet and softer after that, where the morning dew had not fully dried and where the earlier classes had worked the surface. The sled operator, a retired farmer from Arapahoe named Bill Cutter, announced the rules in the current fair record. 412 feet set in 1986 by a John Deere 4755. Dale Vickers heard that number and smiled. He was planning to retire it. The first 5 tractors pulled in order of entry. The best of them in 1982 International 5088, driven by a farmer from Republican City, reached 341 feet before the sled stopped him. Solid pull. The crowd gave him a real cheer. Then Bill Cutter called the John Deere 4960. Dale climbed into the cab, adjusted the air cushioned seat, glanced at the digital display and drove to the line. He set the throttle and waited for the chain to be hooked. Around him, the grandstands had gone quiet in that particular way that grandstands go quiet when everyone expects something inevitable. The flag dropped. The 4960 lunged forward. 100 feet, 200, 350. The sled weight was transferring forward with every foot loading up the chain, but the turbocharged diesel had torque to spare, and it kept driving. 380, 400. The crowd was cheering. 405. The tires began to slip on the softer ground, past the 400-foot mark, spinning and throwing dirt, but the machine had built enough momentum. 410. The sled stopped. Dale stepped out of the cab to a full grandstand on its feet. He took the microphone from the announcer. 410 feet, he said. New Harlan County record. He paused. And in case anyone was wondering, that is what 200 horsepower and 40 years of progress looks like. He handed the mic back and looked across the staging area at Earl Dunnigan, who was sitting on the iron seat of the Minneapolis Moline with his hands on his knees waiting. Then Bill Cutter called the last entry in the heavyweight class. Let me tell you about the next few minutes, he said, because they're the reason people in Alma are still talking about the 1988 Harlan County Fair. Earl had not started the Minneapolis Moline in 11 years when he pulled the tarp off it in June. He had gone into the barn that evening after supper, after sitting at the kitchen table for a long time with a cup of coffee that had gone cold, thinking about what Dale Vickers had said at the coffee shop in Alma. He had not planned to go into the barn. He had been sitting there, and then he was standing up and walking out the back door and across the yard the way a man moves when his body has made a decision before his mind has finished the argument. He pulled the tarp off and stood in front of the machine for a while, looking at it the way you look at something you have not allowed yourself to look at directly in a long time. The prairie gold paint was dull. There was surface rust on the drawbar and along the bottom of the frame where water had pooled. The tires had held their shape, which they would not have done if he had not let the air down every winter. He walked around it once, then crouched down beside the left rear wheel and pressed his thumb against the sidewall. Still firm, still holding. He went back to the house and got a flashlight and his father's service manual, which he had kept in the bottom drawer of the desk in the spare room since 1970, and he went back out to the barn and started at the beginning. Let me tell you about the 6 weeks that followed, because the work Earl did in that barn is the part of this story that Dale Vickers never saw and never understood. The first night Earl drained the fuel tank and flushed it with clean diesel and found sediment in the bottom that had settled over 11 years into a fine rust-colored layer that came out in the drain pan like sand from a riverbed. He did not curse about it. He wrote it down in a small spiral notebook he kept in his shirt pocket, the same kind of notebook he had used for every maintenance job on every piece of equipment he had ever owned. Tank flush, sediment, check injector lines. The carburetor had gummed from sitting. He pulled it, disassembled it on the workbench, soaked every piece in a jar of clean diesel overnight, and reassembled it in the morning. Cost nothing. He had the diesel, he had the jars, he had the time. The magneto checked out. He had expected to replace it and was pleased that he did not have to. The valve seals were worn, which he had also expected. He ordered a valve seal kit from a parts catalog out of Minnesota that still stocked Minneapolis Mullane components. $12 for shipping, $31 for the kit, $43 total. They arrived in 9 days. His father's voice came to him when he was pulling the cylinder head, lying on his back on the cold concrete, with his arms up into the engine bay, the way his father's voice always came when he was working close to the ground. Every broken machine is just a puzzle, Walter used to say. The only question is whether you're patient enough to find all the pieces. Earl found the pieces. The rings were worn but serviceable. The crank bearings were worn but not scored. He cleaned them and re-lubricated them and put them back. He ordered a piston ring set anyway, $89 mail order, because the rings were worn enough that he did not want them failing under load. He ordered an ignition coil, $18, because the old one was original, and he did not trust original on a pull day. He replaced the battery, $38 at the co-op in Alma, paying cash at the counter, while Dale Vickers, parts manager, filled the order without making conversation. Total cost when he added the column in his notebook, $312. He wrote that number at the bottom of the page and looked at it for a moment. Then he wrote the date next to it, June through August, 1988, and closed the notebook and put it in his shirt pocket. The first start attempt was on a Tuesday evening in the 3rd week of July. He primed the carburetor, set the choke, engaged the starter. The engine turned over again, a cough, black smoke from the stack, then silence. He waited 3 minutes, adjusted the choke, tried again. This time it caught rough and uneven at first, the kind of rough that sounds like something breaking rather than something starting. He sat in the seat with his hands on his knees and let it run. The smoke went from black to gray to a thin blue thread. The idle smoothed. Not perfectly smooth, but the kind of smooth that a 40-year-old engine earns rather than is given. He let it run for 20 minutes. Then he shut it down, checked the temperature, checked the oil pressure, wrote both numbers in the notebook. Normal. Within range. He went inside and washed his hands and ate supper and slept better than he had in some time. He ran the engine every evening for 2 weeks after that, 15 to 20 minutes checking temperatures and pressures each time and writing them in the notebook. On the 3rd week of August, 2 weeks before the fair, he hitched the mini-mow to the field cultivator and worked 20 acres of the north field that he had been planning to chisel plow anyway. The machine pulled the cultivator without laboring. The oil temperature stayed where it belonged. The fuel consumption was what the manual said it would be. He unhooked the cultivator and drove the mini-mow back into the barn and sat on the seat for a while in the quiet. His father had bought this machine in 1948 for $1,950 in cash. He had farmed with it for 22 years. Earl had farmed with it for 9 more years after that. And now, after 11 years under a tarp, $312 in parts, had put it back in working condition. Dale Vickers had sold Leonard Marsh a tractor for $68,000. He had sold Pete Colby a tractor for $61,000. He had sold Dwight Salter a tractor for $53,000. $182,000 in equipment debt across 3 farms, and all 3 of those men were farming carefully now. Farming the way you farm when the payment book is open on the kitchen table every month, and the margin between current and behind is thinner than it should be. $312. $182,000. Earl wrote both numbers in the notebook and looked at them together for a while. Then he closed the notebook and started getting the trailer ready for the fair. The morning of the pull, before he loaded the mini-mow onto the trailer, he walked around the machine one final time. He checked the oil, he checked the fuel, he checked the cooling water. Then he crouched beside each rear tire and pressed his thumb into the sidewall, reading the pressure the way his father had taught him, by feel rather than gauge. Both tires were at the factory recommended level. He let 2 pounds of air out of each one. His father had taught him this. Soft ground calls for more contact. Walter had said not more power. You want that tire to spread out and find the firm layer underneath. You don't fight soft ground. You use more of it. Earl stood up and loaded the machine onto the trailer and drove 18 miles to Alma. Now the heavyweight class was down to its last entry, and Bill Cutter was calling the Minneapolis Moline ZTU to the line, and 2,000 people in the grandstands were settling into the particular quiet that comes before something they have not decided yet how to feel about. Let me tell you about what happened next, because this is the part that Harlan County has not stopped talking about since August of 1988. The sound came first, not from the staging area where people were expecting it, from further back from the corner of the implement barn, where Earl had been keeping the mini-mow idling at low throttle while he waited for his number to be called. The sound traveled across the fairground the way certain sounds travel underneath the noise of the crowd rather than through it, finding its way to people by a lower frequency than ordinary engine noise. A 4-cylinder cadence, even and deliberate like a clock that had been running since before anyone in those grandstands was born and had not lost a single beat. People near the back fence heard it first. A few of them turned, then the people in the middle sections of the grandstands, then the announcer, who paused mid-sentence with the microphone still at his lips. That engine note did not sound like the 4960. It did not sound like any of the tractors that had run that afternoon. It sounded older than all of them. It sounded like something that had been doing this work since before the word horsepower meant what it meant now, and it sounded like it intended to keep doing it. Then the vibration reached the grandstands, not through the ground, through the wooden bleacher boards themselves, a low pulse that people felt in the soles of their boots and the backs of their thighs, the physical signature of a naturally aspirated gasoline engine at full choke running on 40-year-old castings that had been machined to tolerances that the factory considered permanent. Old men in the upper rows felt it and recognized it the way you recognize the handwriting of someone you have not heard from in decades. 3 of them looked at each other without speaking. Clarence Webb put both hands on his knees and leaned forward. Then the Minneapolis Moline came around the corner of the implement barn and into the afternoon sun. Prairie gold, faded to the color of old straw. The exhaust pipe rising bare and straight, the rear tires broad and slightly soft, spread against the gravel in the way that tires spread when they are asked to find ground rather than ride above it. Earl Dunnigan sitting upright on the iron seat with no cab around him and no cushion beneath him, and his hands resting on the steering wheel with the particular stillness of a man who is not nervous because he has already done the work that nervousness is supposed to remind you to do. He drove the machine to the line. Bill Cutter nodded to the chainman. The chain went on. Earl set the throttle to where he wanted it, not at the top, not yet 2/3 up the position his father had taught him to start from on soft ground, where you can add power as the load builds, rather than giving the wheels everything at once and letting them spin through the surface before they find purchase. He looked straight ahead at the track. Gus Reinhardt was standing at the edge of the staging area with his clipboard. He had been watching Earl since the machine came around the barn. He looked at the tire pressure. He looked at the throttle position. He wrote something on his clipboard and underlined it. The flag came down. Earl pushed the throttle to 3/4. The Minneapolis Moline moved. No lunge, no wheel spin throwing dirt in a rooster tail, the way the 4960 had thrown it. The rear tires compressed against the track and found the firm layer 2 inches beneath the surface. The layer that morning dew had not reached, and they pressed into it and pushed, and the machine moved forward with the particular steadiness of something that is doing exactly what it was designed to do and has no interest in doing anything else. 100 feet. The crowd made a sound, a low collective murmur, the sound of people revising an expectation. 150 feet. The engine note did not change. That was the thing people noticed later when they talked about it, which was often. The engine note did not change. With the 4960, with every tractor that had run that afternoon, you could hear the load building. You could hear the engine working harder as the sled weight transferred forward, the pitch rising, and the sound roughening as the machine reached its limit. With the Minneapolis Moline, the sound stayed the same. The load was building. The chain was tight enough to vibrate. But the engine was delivering its power at the same cadence it had been delivering it since Earl pushed the throttle forward even and flat the way a flat torque curve sounds when it is under load. 200 feet, 250. People were on their feet. 300 feet. The soft ground section. The same section where the 4960 had begun to slip at 380 feet, where the electronic traction sensors had detected wheel spin and pulled power back to protect the drivetrain. Earl felt the surface change through the seat. He felt the rear tires working harder, felt the slight hesitation as the top layer of soil gave way and the tires pushed through it to find the firmer ground beneath. He pushed the throttle to full. There was no sensor to override him. There was no computer to decide that the load had exceeded safe parameters. There was a throttle cable connected to a carburetor needle, connected to a fuel bowl, and Earl pushed it forward, and the engine took the fuel and made power with it, all the power it had, without asking anyone's permission. 320 feet, 340. Leonard Marsh was standing on the grandstand bench. He did not remember standing up. 360, 380. The rear tires were spinning now. Not freely, not the way tires spin when they have lost traction entirely, but working, churning through the soft layer and compressing the firm layer and finding the next inch in the inch after that. The exhaust stack was throwing black smoke, not the thin thread of a warmed engine at idle, but the full black column of an engine at maximum output burning every bit of fuel it was given. 390, 400. Dwight Salter had his hand over his mouth. 405, 410. The crowd noise had become something that was no longer organized into cheering. It was continuous, a wall of sound people who had stopped being spectators and become something else. People who needed this to keep going the way you need something to keep going when you have stopped being able to explain why it matters so much. His father's voice somewhere beneath the engine noise and the crowd noise and the sound of the chain vibrating under load. This machine will outlast both of us. 411 feet. The sled stopped. The Minneapolis Moline's rear tires spun freely for 2 full seconds, throwing soil and arcs behind them, and then Earl pulled the throttle back and the engine settled to idle, and the fairground was for one long moment completely silent. Not quiet, silent. The kind of silence that happens when 2,000 people are holding the same breath. Earl sat on the iron seat with his hands on his knees. He did not raise his arms. He did not stand up. He looked at the distance marker that Bill Cutter was walking out to confirm, and he read the number on it, and he nodded once to himself the way his father used to nod when something came out the way it was supposed to. Then the grandstands came apart. Clarence Webb was on his feet, both arms in the air, shouting something that nobody near him could hear, because everyone near him was also shouting. Leonard Marsh was crying openly, not bothering to do anything about it, and he would not have been able to explain to anyone watching him exactly why he was crying, except that something had happened today that he had needed to see and had not known he needed to see until it was happening. Pete Colby had his arm around his wife, and she was gripping his forearm with both hands. Dwight Salter sat down heavily on the bench and put his elbows on his knees and stared at the track. Gus Reinhardt walked out to the distance marker, read the number, walked back, and handed Bill Cutter the official result. 411 feet, Bill Cutter said into the microphone. New Harlan County Fair record. The sound from the grandstands went up again. Dale Vickers stood at the edge of the staging area and did not move. His face had gone the color of old limestone, a pale that was not quite gray, but was not far from it. His arms were at his sides. The John Deere hat that he had been wearing since 7 that morning was in his hand now, and he was turning it slowly by the brim, the green bill creasing and releasing, under his fingers creasing and releasing, without his seeming to know he was doing it. He was not looking at the grandstands. He was not looking at the announcer, or at Gus Reinhardt, or at any of the people around him. He was looking at the Minneapolis-Moline ZTU, sitting at the end of the track with its engine at idle and its exhaust stack throwing a thin thread of smoke into the August afternoon. He stood there for a long time. Earl shut down the engine. The fairground did not go quiet when the engine stopped. The crowd was still cheering. But underneath the cheering for the people standing close enough, there was suddenly the absence of that four-cylinder cadence, and the absence was almost as loud as the sound had been. Earl climbed down from the iron seat. His legs were steadier than he had expected them to be. He stood beside the machine for a moment, with one hand on the rear fender, not for support, just contact the way you put your hand on something you trust. From the grandstands, Leonard Marsh was already coming down the steps. Behind him, Pete Colby. Behind Pete, Dwight Salter, moving slowly like a man who has made a decision he has not finished making yet. They crossed the staging area together, the three of them walking toward Earl Dunnigan and the machine that had just set a record with $312 in parts and 40 years of someone paying attention. They had something they needed to say. Leonard Marsh reached Earl first. He stopped a few feet away, the way a man stops when he has rehearsed something in his head, and now that he is standing in front of the person he rehearsed it for, the rehearsed version does not seem like enough, Earl, he said. I just want you to know. Watching that, he stopped, started again. I've been farming this county for 23 years, and I have never seen anything like what just happened on that track. Earl looked at him. I bought a 4955 from Dale in '85, Leisner said. $68,000, 14%. He paused. I'm current on my payments, but I want you to understand what current means. It means my wife hasn't bought a new coat in 3 years. It means I watched my neighbor lose his ground, and I didn't do anything because I was afraid if I looked too hard at his situation, I'd see mine. Pete Colby came up beside Leonard. 3 months behind on my 4450, Pete said, $61,000. Dale told me the financing was structured to give me room. He said those words, room to breathe. He looked at the ground. I haven't had room to breathe since I signed. Dwight Salter stood a little apart from the other two. He was looking at the Minneapolis-Moline rather than at Earl. I sold 80 acres, he said. My grandfather broke that ground. He did not say anything else for a moment. I sold it to make the down payment on a machine Dale told me I needed. Earl listened to all three of them without interrupting. When Dwight finished, Earl was quiet for a moment. Then he said, how much does Dale know about where each of you stands? Leonard answered, he knows everything. He's the one who introduced us to the farm credit loan officers. He was in the room when we signed. Earl looked across the staging area toward the dealer's display area where Dale Vickers was still standing at the edge of the track with his hat in his hand. He nodded once the way his father used to nod when he had finished measuring something and was ready to act on the measurement. Then he said, come find me tomorrow morning. I want to look at your loan documents. He turned back to the Minneapolis-Moline, climbed up to the seat, and started the engine. He drove the machine back to the trailer by himself in the same unhurried way he had driven it off the trailer that morning, and he loaded it and hooked the chains and drove 18 miles home to the farm in Alma. He did not stop in town. He did not talk to the reporters who had come down from the grandstands looking for him, and he had work to do in the morning, and he needed to be rested for it. The next morning, a Friday, Earl was in the kitchen at 5:30 when Leonard Marsh's truck pulled into the yard. Pete Colby was in the passenger seat. Dwight Salter came separately 10 minutes later. Earl put coffee on, and they sat at the kitchen table and spread the loan documents out across the oilcloth, and Earl read them the way his father had taught him to read anything involving money, which was slowly and without assuming that the person who wrote them had your interests in mind. He was not a lawyer. He told them that plainly at the beginning. But he could read numbers, and what the numbers said in Leonard Marsh's documents was that the variable rate clause would allow the lender to adjust the interest rate annually, and that the rate Leonard was paying in 1988 was 2 points higher than the rate he had been quoted in 1985, and that this had added $11,000 to the total cost of the loan over 3 years without Leonard being clearly notified that it had happened. Earl pointed to the clause. He read the relevant sentence aloud. He put a pencil mark in the margin. "I'd take this to the Farm Credit Mediation Office in Hastings," Earl said. "Not as a complaint, as a question. Ask them to explain this clause in plain language and ask them whether the adjustment was properly disclosed. Don't go in angry. Go in with the document and a pencil and ask questions." Leonard looked at the clause, then at Earl. "You think they made an error?" "I think there are questions worth asking," Earl said. "And I think a man who shows up with his documents and his pencil and asks specific questions gets treated differently than a man who shows up angry." He spent 3 hours at that kitchen table. When they left, each of the three men had a list of specific questions written in Earl's handwriting on a piece of lined paper torn from the same spiral notebook where he kept his maintenance records. Let me tell you about what happened to those 3 farms, because that story runs parallel to everything else, and it is part of the same story. Leonard Marsh took his documents to the Farm Credit Mediation Office in Hastings in October of 1988. The variable rate adjustment had not been properly disclosed under the terms of the 1985 Agriculture Credit Act. The lender restructured his loan at the original fixed rate retroactive to 1986. The difference applied to principal reduced his remaining balance by $14,000. Leonard made his final payment in the spring of 1994. He is still farming 160 acres in the northeast corner of Harlan County. His son farms with him now. Pete Colby sold the 4450 in the fall of 1988 and bought a 1974 International 1086 from a retiring farmer in Arapahoe for $3,800 cash. He paid off his remaining farm credit balance in 1991. He told people for years afterward that selling the 4450 was the best decision he ever made, and that it had taken watching a 40-year-old tractor set a county record to make him see that he could do it. Dwight Salter did not get his 80 acres back. That ground was gone. But the 120 acres he held on to were debt-free by 1993, and in 2001, his son purchased 40 acres of adjacent ground at auction and brought the family operation back to 160 acres. Dwight was at that auction. He paid cash for a used chisel plow the same day his son bought the ground, and he wrote the total in a small notebook he had started keeping in the same way Earl kept his maintenance records. Earl Dunnigan went back to farming 320 acres the Monday after the fair, as if the fair had not happened, because for him, it largely had not. He still had corn to lay by and beans to watch and a 402. Oh, that needed a new water pump before harvest. He did those things in the order they needed doing. He did not go to Vickers Farm Equipment the day after the fair or the week after. He went in September on a Tuesday morning after he had finished the water pump on the 4020, and before he started running the combine. He parked his truck on the street and walked in through the front door and waited at the counter while Dale's parts manager finished a phone order. Dale came out of the back office and stopped when he saw Earl standing there. Earl, Dale. Dale looked at the counter between them. Then he looked at Earl's shirt pocket where the spiral notebook was. Then back at Earl's face. Earl reached into his shirt pocket and set the notebook on the counter open to the last page of maintenance records. The column of numbers, the total at the bottom, $312. The date range written beside it, 1962 through 1988. "That's every dollar I've spent on the Minneapolis Moline," Earl said. "In 26 years. Dale looked at the numbers. His jaw tightened slightly, then released. "You told me this spring that machine couldn't pull a hay wagon," Earl said. "It pulled 411 feet of sled." He paused to let that settle before he continued. "You've been telling Leonard Marsh and Pete Colby and Dwight Salter that their old equipment was holding them back." "It wasn't holding them back, Dale. The debt was." The young parts manager at the end of the counter had stopped pretending to organize inventory. He was listening. Dale said nothing for a moment. Then, "Earl, I've been in this business for 10 years. I've seen what happens to farmers who can't modernize. I've seen operations that ran old equipment right into the ground because they wouldn't invest in what they needed." Earl looked at him steadily. Leonard Marsh is current on a loan you put him in. He looked at the notebook. Barely. Pete Colby was 3 months behind. Dwight Salter sold 80 acres his grandfather broke. He picked up the notebook. Those men needed equipment they could afford to own, Dale. Not equipment they could afford to finance. There's a difference between those two things, and I think you know there is. He put the notebook back in his shirt pocket. For the record, he said. He set the official fair result sheet on the counter, the one with Gus Reinhardt's signature at the bottom. 411 feet, new Harlan County record. He turned and walked out without looking back. Behind him, Dale Vickers stood at his own counter and looked at the fair result sheet for a long time. The parts manager did not say anything. The phone rang twice and neither of them answered it. Let me tell you about what happened to Vickers Farm Equipment in the years that followed. Farm equipment sales in Nebraska declined 40% between 1985 and 1990 as the farm credit crisis worked its way through to its conclusion. Dealerships that had built their business on financing decisions made during the boom years found themselves holding paper that the farms behind it could not support. Dale Vickers was not the only John Deere dealer in Nebraska who had pushed hard on financing during the early 1980s, and he was not the only one who felt the consequences of having done so. He sold Vickers Farm Equipment in the spring of 1992 to an equipment group out of Lincoln for less than the value of the inventory on the floor. The sign came down in March of that year, a Tuesday morning, and a man Earl did not recognize drove away with it in the back of a pickup truck. The building became a farm supply store. The new owners kept the parts counter, but not the service bays. Dale moved to Grand Island with his wife and took a job in commercial real estate, which suited him better than the parts business had suited him in the end, and which he was good at for the same reasons he had been good at selling equipment, which was that he was quick and warm, and he remembered names. Earl heard through various channels that Dale had done well in Grand Island, and that he did not talk much about Alma or the dealership when people asked. This did not surprise Earl. There are things that are easier not to talk about, and Earl had enough of his own not to spend time cataloging other people's. It was 9 years after the fair in 1997 that Earl saw Dale Vickers again. He was at a sale barn in Hastings looking at a used field cultivator that a retiring farmer from Clay County was selling when he heard his name from across the lot. He turned and there was Dale older. Now the salesman's ease still present, but quieter, wearing it differently, the way you wear something after it has been washed many times and lost some of its original stiffness. Dale came across the lot and stopped a few feet away. He was alone. No one with him. "Earl," he said. "Dale." Dale looked at the ground for a moment, then at Earl. "I've been thinking about what you said in the dealership after the fair." Earl waited. "The debt," Dale said. "You said it was the debt that held them back, not the equipment." He paused. "I've thought about that a lot over the years." He looked at his hands briefly, then back at Earl. "I sold a lot of men equipment they didn't need with money they didn't have. At the time, I told myself I was helping them stay competitive. I told myself the financing was just a tool." He stopped. "I don't think that's what I was doing." Earl looked at him for a long moment. "Leonard Marsh is still farming," he said. "I know. Pete Colby's boy is farming now, too. 16 years old, already knows how to run the combine. And Dwight Salter's son bought 40 acres at auction last fall." Dale nodded slowly. "That's something he said. That's the part that matters," Earl said. "Not what I pulled, what they're still doing." Dale stood with that for a moment. He did not try to add anything to it or qualify it or redirect it. He just stood with it. They shook hands briefly, and Earl went back to looking at the cultivator, and Dale walked back across the lot toward wherever he had come from, and that was the last time Earl Dunnigan and Dale Vickers spoke to each other. Let me tell you about the years that followed, because the story does not end at that sale barn in Hastings. Earl farmed 320 acres until 2001, 13 years after the fair. He used the John Deere 4020 for heavy tillage and the Minneapolis Moline A for lighter work dissing and cultivating, and the Bues that did not require 200 horsepower to complete properly. In those 13 years, he put $847 more into the Minimo, which he wrote in the spiral notebook in the same column he had started in 1962, and he put $2,100 into the 4020, and he did not take on a dollar of equipment debt in any of those years. He maintained the same fields his grandfather had broken, and his father had cultivated and he had farmed since 1962, and he knew every drainage pattern and every corner post and every low spot where the water stood in a wet spring, and he farmed that knowledge rather than farming the equipment, which is a distinction that matters more than most people in the equipment business would like it to matter. Clarence Webb came out to the farm occasionally in those years, less often as the years went on, and the drive became harder for him. And he would sit in the kitchen and drink coffee, and they would talk about equipment and farming and the county, the way old men talk about things they have watched change, which is with a particular mixture of clarity and affection that does not require any judgment about whether the change was good or bad. Clarence died in 1999 at the age of 89 in his own house in the same county where he had been born. His obituary in the Alma paper mentioned that he had farmed with a Farmall M for 31 years and had never purchased a new tractor on credit. In September of 2001, Earl Dunnigan was walking the south field before harvest, checking the corn the way he had checked it every year, moving along the rows with his hands touching the stalks, reading the weight of the ears by Phil, calculating the yield in the way that comes from 40 years of doing the same thing in the same field every fall. His heart stopped somewhere in the middle of that field cleanly and without warning, the way Walter Dunnigan's heart had stopped in the south field 31 years before him. They found him in the evening when he did not come in for supper. He was 77 years old. He had not owed money to anyone in his life. His funeral was held at the Methodist Church in Alma on a Thursday morning. The pews held more people than the church had been designed for, and there were people standing in the entry and along the sidewalls who had driven from Clay County and Furnace County and Franklin County, farmers who had known Earl through the auction circuit and the co-op, in the particular slow accumulation of reputation that happens in agricultural communities over decades. Leonard Marsh was there. Pete Colby was there with his son, who was 29 years old and farming full-time. Dwight Salter was there with his son and his son's wife. Gus Reinhardt drove down from Grand Island, where he was now working for the Nebraska Department of Agriculture. He sat in the back row and did not speak to anyone, and after the service, he stood for a while beside the Minneapolis Moline, which Thomas Dunnigan had parked in the churchyard because it seemed like the right thing to do, and then he drove back to Grand Island. Thomas Dunnigan, Earl's older son, came home from Omaha and found the farm in the same condition it had always been in, which is to say that everything was maintained and nothing was owed. The 4020 had been serviced in the spring and was ready for harvest. The mini-mow was in the back of the barn with a tarp over it, clean underneath the tarp, the tires let down to the same 2 pounds below the factory specification that Walter Dunnigan had established in 1970, and Earl Dunnigan had maintained every winter since. Thomas found the spiral notebook in the desk drawer in the spare room. He opened it and read the columns of numbers from 1962 through 2001, the maintenance records for the Minneapolis Moline across 39 years. The total at the bottom in Earl's handwriting was $1,159. 39 years of keeping a machine running. $1,159. He put the notebook back in the desk drawer and went out to the barn and sat for a while with the machine under the tarp. In 2005, a museum in Kearney contacted Thomas about acquiring the Minneapolis Moline ZTU. They offered $45,000. It was more money than the tractor had ever been worth by any reasonable measure, and more money than Thomas had expected anyone to offer for it. He turned them down. He was not a farmer, not in the way Earl had been a farmer, but he understood what the machine was, and what it was not something that belonged in a museum. He called his son Walter, who was 17 at the time, and living with his mother in Omaha, and told him about the offer and why he had turned it down. Walter listened. He asked one question. "Can you teach me how to start it?" Thomas drove to Omaha the following weekend and brought Walter back to the farm, and they spent 3 days in the barn going through Earl's maintenance notebook page by page, Thomas reading the entries aloud, while Walter wrote down the things he needed to remember. On the third day, Walter started the Minneapolis Moline himself on the first try with the choke set the way the manual said, to set it and the throttle position it where Earl had always positioned it at cold start. The engine caught and settled into the same 4-cylinder cadence that Earl had listened to in the barn in the summer of 1988, the same cadence that had traveled across the Harlan County Fairground before anyone could see the machine that was making it. Walter was 17 years old, and he sat on the iron seat with his hands on the steering wheel and the engine running, and he did not say anything for a long time. He was 23 when he drove the Minneapolis Moline ZTU to the Harlan County Fair for the first time in his own name, entering the Heritage class, which the Fair Board had created the year after Earl's poll, specifically for tractors over 30 years old. He won it. The tractor was 57 years old that year and started on the first try in the staging area and ran the Heritage class pull without complaint and started again for the drive back to the trailer without complaint. Gus Reinhardt heard about it from someone at the Nebraska Department of Agriculture who had been at the fair, and he drove to Alma the following week to see the machine. He stood in the barn with Walter and looked at it for a long time without speaking. "That's the same tractor," Gus said finally. Walter nodded. "I watched your great-grandfather pull 411 feet with this machine." He paused. "I've never seen anything like it. Not before and not since." Walter ran his hand along the rear fender. "My great-grandfather used to say this machine would outlast all of them." Gus looked at the engine, the castings, the drawbar, the rear tires still showing the slight flatness at the contact patch from being stored at 2 pounds below factory specification winter after winter, the way Walter had learned to store them from Thomas, who had learned it from Earl, who had learned it from Walter Dunnigan in 1962. It has Gus said. Let me tell you about what Earl Dunnigan proved, because it was not about the tractor pull. The lesson that September afternoon was not complicated, and it was not new. It was the same lesson that Walter Dunnigan had known when he paid $1,950 cash across the counter in 1948, and that Earl had learned watching his father work, and that Earl had spent 26 years applying before he drove 18 miles to Alma with a machine on a trailer and $312 of maintenance in the logbook. The lesson is this: farmland in Nebraska today averages $4,000 to $5,200 per acre. Young farmers entering the profession are looking at equipment financing packages that would have seemed impossible in 1988, six-figure loans on machines with computers that control what the driver can and cannot do with service agreements, that require the manufacturer's technician to unlock basic repairs with monthly payments, that leave the same narrow margin that Pete Colby was living on in the fall of 1988. The numbers are different. The structure is the same. Dale Vickers believed that new was better. He believed it genuinely, not cynically, and that is the most important part of understanding what happened, because it means the lesson is not about bad men. It is about bad arithmetic. Equipment that costs more than you can afford to own does not make you competitive. It makes you dependent. Maintenance costs less than payments. Knowledge weighs less than debt. A machine you understand is safer than a machine that understands itself. Earl Dunnigan spent $1,159 on the Minneapolis Moline ZTU across 39 years. His neighbors spent a combined $182,000 on equipment financed through a man who believed he was helping them. Earl kept his farm. Two of his three neighbors kept theirs by the narrowest possible margins, and the third lost 80 acres he never recovered. The fourth outcome, the one that did not happen, was Earl's. And it did not happen because Earl had learned from his father that the question is never what a machine costs to buy. The question is what it costs to keep. The Minneapolis Moline ZTU is 76 years old. It still starts on the first try. If you grew up around equipment like this, if you remember what a 4-cylinder gasoline tractor sounds like at full pull, or what it means to change your own oil, and set your own valves and know every bolt on the machine you depend on, drop the year in the comments. Tell me what your father ran. Tell me what you kept when everyone told you to sell it. And if this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. There are more men like Earl Dunnigan. There are more machines like the Mini Mo sitting under tarps in barns across Nebraska and Iowa and Kansas and every other state where farming is old enough to have a memory. We will tell those stories. The Minneapolis Moline is in the barn on the Dunnigan place in Alma. Walter checks it every winter. He lets 2 pounds of air out of each rear tire. He wipes it down. He checks the oil. His great-grandfather taught his grandfather to do this. His grandfather taught his father. His father taught him. The machine will outlast all of them. Walter Dunnigan said so in 1948, and so far he has been right.